Welcome back to the Pens and Poison podcast. I'm your host, Lisa, and I have a very special guest with me here today. I have the poet, Joseph Massey, who has just released his latest poetry book, America is the Poem. Really excited to have you here today, Joseph. Why don't you start off, tell us a little bit about your poetry journey. You just published a book, which is a #1 bestseller on Amazon, which is really exciting. Tell us a little bit about where you started and how you got to where you're at today.
It's a long story. Let me try to condense it. I started writing when I was 12. I was a delinquent child, and I was told to sit in the school auditorium for almost the entire 6th grade year. Just don't even go to class anymore because I was so disruptive. And it was while I was in school suspension that I picked up a copy of a biography about Jim Morrison, of all people.
Okay.
Didn't like The Doors. I just bought it because the title sounded interesting. No one here gets out alive. It appealed to my 12-year-old sensibilities.
Sure.
And in the early chapters, it talked about Jim Morrison's appreciation for the French poet Arthur Rimbaud.
Yes.
And also his fascination with Nietzsche and the Beats, particularly Kerouac and Ginsberg. And so while I was in in-school suspension, I sought those poets out. So I was in in-school suspension, and it was there I started writing. I kept a composition book. Yeah, that was the beginning. And then my education in poetry was through mentors. When I was 15, I started writing to poets. I wrote to Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg wrote back, and he told me to read William Carlos Williams, which was very transformative, instructive thing. And and to really shorten it up, my 20s were quite tumultuous, but poetry was always the anchor for me. And it was in my 20s when I started getting published, but I was never really into the whole careerist aspect of things. The career thing just caught up with me, and here I am. I was canceled in 2018. That's a whole other saga. But I made it through that and rebuilt outside of the poetry establishment.
Yeah, poetry establishment can be quite rough. How wonderful that you were able to get in touch with Allen Ginsberg, who I believe died before I was even born.
He died not long after I wrote to him.
Really fantastic world that we live in, where there are poets who write great poetry and we know them as household names and they respond to young poets. Fantastic. Great. It sounds like you've made quite a career for yourself since leaving maybe the mainstream poetry establishment, which I have my own qualms with, as anyone who listens to me know. But why don't you tell us a little bit about just how you got to where you're at with your career? You have a pretty big Substack following. You were on Megyn Kelly last week. It sounds like you're making really big strides. And I think our audiences are always interested in hearing kind of success stories from poets. You had a little bit maybe of a career blip in 2018. What were some of the steps that you took to build up to where you're at today?
Yeah, so prior to the cancellation, I was managing to be successful almost despite myself in the poetry establishment, like getting reviewed in the New York Times and teaching. I was teaching at UPenn and their big online poetry course called ModPo. And they would bring me down a couple times a year and have me read and talk and stuff. So when I was canceled, all that went away. I had a book ready to come out through Wesleyan University Press that was canceled. Everything went to hell. And over the course of a year, I had to kind of rebuild myself personally. But I kept writing throughout the whole thing. In 2019, I wrote an essay for Quillette about my cancellation, and that sort of laid the foundation for rebuilding a career because I started to come back on social media, started gaining more followers. When Substack came along, it just seemed like a perfect opportunity to disseminate my work because I no longer publish with literary journals and magazines because they're too spineless. All it takes is an email or two from someone saying you should get rid of this person, and they usually will do it.
Sure.
So I just do Substack. And so it's been a slow, steady process. And then I started my own book in print, just publishing through Amazon because I don't want to publish with any publishers for the same reason I don't want to publish in magazines and journals. I don't want my book getting suddenly pulled for no explanation. So it's just been a long, steady process and luck, really. Like Megyn Kelly, I don't know how she even found me. She started following me on Twitter. I never would have guessed.
I loved I think the moment that I started really paying attention to your poetry, reading your poems, was with America's the poem around the inauguration. I thought that was really fantastic. And I know that kind of big poem got a lot of really great feedback and got a lot of views as well. So I think it sounds like you've done a fantastic job rebuilding yourself and going very bravely into this kind of poetry world where a lot of people are very harsh and unforgiving in it. And I think that the fact that you've found this kind of opportunity for redemption and you found a way to make it despite all of that is really brilliant. I can't think of any other poets who have been self-published who have just had such great success. So I think kudos to you for figuring out how to build that up. I'd like to talk a little bit about your poetry and kind of your writing process here. I know you have obviously that inauguration poem that I just mentioned. You have some kind of nature-inspired poetry. You have maybe some kind of religious-inspired poetry. What is your writing process like, and where do you get a lot of this inspiration from?
The writing process usually always begins in notebooks with a pen. Usually always starts in notebooks, taking notes, and usually outside, walking, sitting down somewhere, taking notes. That's really the gist of my process. I do write indoors occasionally. All the revising and stuff goes on indoors. But I like to get all the raw material usually when I'm out walking. And that's basically the process. And then you probably revise a lot too. You're a novelist. I can't imagine. That's a lot of words to have to deal with.
In those stages right now, I don't know if you've just completed my latest novel, and I'm starting to acquire beta readers for that as of this morning, and that's going to be a really big revision process. But yeah, a lot of it is revising. So it sounds like you revise your poetry a lot.
Yeah.
How many revisions do your poems go through, or do you revise as you go?
It really varies from poem to poem, but some poems could go through 100 revisions, just going back the next day and the next day, seeing what sounds different and moving things around. I could spend a whole day just on a comma. As sad as that is, that's why I can't write novels.
Fair enough.
I would never finish it. I never get past the first chapter, or it just would be a very short novel.
Yeah.
10 pages. But like the title poem of the book, America's the Poem, that was written incrementally with notes, and then it was just magically sutured itself together. It sounded like all the notes came together in such a way, but it still went through lots of revisions. I actually was doing something different with that one where I was printing the poem out, which I rarely ever do, printing it out, taking the print out, scratching things out, and I really wanted it to be as good as I can make it because it's a hard thing to write an inaugural poem. I didn't know how I was going to go about that. It seemed like a joke at first when I announced on Twitter or X that I was going to try to do this. I want to be the inaugural poet. And in the back of my head, I was like, I don't know how in the hell you're going to do that. How will you approach such a thing? How do you write about America? I don't know. Walt Whitman did it, but he did it in a whole book, not in one poem. And the other inaugural poems just aren't very good.
Normandy. Oh my. What an experience. She published a full book. Some terrible poetry book she published that was not very good. I don't know how we got her as the poet laureate, but here we are.
Here we are, yeah. So I did not get to read the poem at the inauguration, but from what I heard, I got close. There was people close to the top of the Trump team who were putting the word out, but I always knew it was a long shot. So I really became focused on just writing a good poem that I could be proud of, and it was a challenge to write about something as vast and abstract as America.
Absolutely. Speaking of inauguration and America, and I don't want to get too political on this show, but one thing I've really wondered is the poetry world in general is very left-wing. I think that is a fair statement to say. I don't think anyone will have any objection. And how do you navigate that? I think it's something that a lot of people are wondering, because I know so many kind of maybe centrist or more conservative leaning or libertarian people who don't fit that kind of far left docket, who are interested in poetry but are maybe shut out of it or maybe don't write about the right things. I noticed some of your poems are maybe inspired by your faith. How do you reconcile all of this?
I really, truly think I know the answer is in doing it yourself, forming collectives with other young writers who know that the game is cooked from the get-go. Unless you fit a certain identity and you put it up front that this is your identity, you're not going to make it. And I don't know if you saw, I saw it this morning, somebody revealed that they had been submitting poems to a bunch of journals under different aliases, poems that they had submitted under their own name and got rejected constantly. But when they changed the bios to genderqueer or this and that, like making it, spicing it up, as it were,
Oh, yeah.
they got published by everybody. Their poems were getting accepted left and right. This person just published a whole book of these fake poems that they wrote under fake aliases. I just read it this morning. I was amazed. But that goes to show you, like, there are people I knew in the poetry world for a long time who never showed signs of being autistic or whatever, but now they're suddenly autistic. They're putting it in their bios, like such and such is an autistic poet who lives in, and if you look at the Academy of American Poets, they do their poem a day thing. Almost every single bio of every single poet opens with such and such is a identity. And it's so obvious that it's not about the quality of the work. And for a real artist, it is about the quality of the work.
Exactly.
And for poetry's a serious thing. I don't take it lightly. And I can see young people forming collectives outside of that mainstream blob and making headway, which is the same as it's always been. Like Ezra Pound and the modernists, they started little magazines to go against the mainstream. But now it's all mainstream. It's all connected to academia. It's all watered down identity poetry.
Yeah, and I think even the like little tiny poetry magazines that have a readership of 4 people are still that because they're started by those sorts of people. And I think exactly what you said is really unfortunate that we're so hyper focused on identity, and I think not even in the kind of bio aspect of the poet, but also in terms of what the poet is writing and what the poems are about. I had a professor at Columbia who wrote a poem in the form of a vulva, and that was one of the woman who was teaching writing, and I was just like, here we are. I never took a creative writing. That wasn't even a creative writing class. That was just the mandatory writing class.
It sounds pretty creative to me.
Oh, yeah. And for that reason, I never enrolled in any sort of creative writing classes. I've never once taken, aside from that one mandatory writing class that taught me absolutely nothing, never taken any writing classes because the people who are teaching them are just so identity focused. I was enrolled in one creative writing class one semester. I dropped it after a week because the first day we read basically just a series of identity poems, and the professor, the grad student. So I find that it's just such a difficult world to navigate. And I echo everything that you're saying in terms of the person who was writing their poems and they sent it out under that kind of genderqueer alias or whatever that was, because I do see so much of that happening. I think there was a couple of years ago, there was like this white poet who decided to write about some other ethnicity and then switched their like bio, and then all of a sudden started to get published. So
yeah, he became an Asian woman.
Yeah, yes, that was what.
And he got into the Best American Poetry Anthology.
Yeah, what a world we live in. I definitely see it in the novel world as well. I've been less involved in the poetry world. I do write poetry, but I've been a little bit less involved in the poetry sphere for this very reason. I think it is probably the worst in poetry, and then novels get a little bit better, and then nonfiction is probably the best in terms of writing because you have kind of people from all across the board. If you look at what's being published in the nonfiction world, there are always books coming out by conservatives, and there are even conservative imprints of Penguin, right? I think that's like where Ben Shapiro gets his books published. They have like special imprint. But that doesn't exist as much for fiction and poetry, and I think that's quite unfortunate because what that's done is, first of all, push out a lot of people who would read contemporary novels and would read contemporary poetry, but stay away from that whole sphere because they know it's so ideologically driven. And I
Yeah.
know a lot of people just in my personal circles that may be interested in the humanities and writing and whatnot, but that just have fully distanced themselves from all of that because they just see it essentially as a clown show, which it is, unfortunately. And I think part of what I've been very adamant about in my own work is trying to bring back literature and the literary tradition to everyone who doesn't fit the far left docket, whether that's classical liberal or a conservative or a libertarian. I think all of those people are very much being shut out from these spaces. And I think that's so unfortunate because we need the humanities, we need the humanistic side of education. Talented writers are going into completely unrelated fields because they feel pushed out by all of this. And
Yeah.
I do think we're seeing a shift with the vibe shift, as they say, but I still think the other problem on the other side is that a lot of conservatives aren't as just fundamentally interested in writing and poetry because it's been just so ideologically captured, and they equate it with the ideology as opposed to seeing it for its own thing. And I think that's also been a little bit of an unfortunate shift. What do you think of
Yeah.
that? This idea that maybe conservatives are not reading as much because of what's going on in the ideological space.
It makes perfect sense. Even in I'm not as keyed into the fiction world as I am poetry, but I notice that in the fiction world, it's almost as bad. Like you were saying, it's not as bad as it is with poetry. I'm generalizing, but yeah, I think that for many readers, they feel shut out of literature. It's something that the ivory tower does. It's not relatable, or they feel that it's not going to be relatable to them. And that's my sense of things. And then with the publication of this book, America is the Poem, I'm hearing from so many, presumably more conservative readers who say that they haven't read poetry since they were a kid and they were forced to do it in school. They find themselves really enjoying it.
Yeah.
And I think poetry, it's there to be enjoyed. It's a deep kind of enjoyment. It's an immersive kind of enjoyment. It's an investment of your time and your attention. And I can't think of anything more useful in this day and age. Sit with a poem rather than sit and doom scroll, fry your brain, and get cracked out on dopamine. Get cracked out on poetry. Read Keats. Read great poems. But the thing, and I hear from people too, they're like, where is it? Where is good poetry? Where is it? I can't find it. And it's really sad because I end up having to say, you're not going to find it in contemporary poetry. It's going to be very hard to find.
Sure. Yeah. And I do think that poetry transcends all political considerations, and the fact that it's been so hyper politicized today is just quite a disservice to Keats. If you take any Keats poem, and the great thing about the great romantics is that they were actually very politically diversified. Shelley was pretty far left, even by today's standards. He was like trying to be a socialist and a vegetarian and all of this. And then Coleridge and Wordsworth were a lot more conservative, and they maybe held monarchist adjacent beliefs. Keats was somewhere in the middle. So I think it's really great that even within that great romantic tradition, there were people from all across the aisle, and they were engaging with each other's poetry. I think Keats obviously passed away very young, but he was starting to get into that world, some of the older romantic poets. And I think none of their poetry really has anything to do with politics or anything like that. You read Shelley, and I know all of these things about Shelley because I'm just interested in learning about the poets' lives, but if you read a Shelley poem, you would never know that he was socialist adjacent. He writes about the human condition with Ozymandias, and if you look at poem, right, Ode to a Nightingale has nothing to do with politics whatsoever. It's about death and this struggle of being human and this desire to escape in nature. It was the sublime, as we call it, and I think it's so unfortunate that we've lost this kind of Burkean conception of the beautiful and the sublime, which I always return to when I think of poetry, because those are really the two facets that should comprise the full human aesthetic experience, and instead we've reduced it to simply politics.
And once the poem is reduced to politics, it becomes like dead on arrival. I'm talking about the poems that just rely on their politics. There's no craft, there's no attention to the language itself. The language is just flaccid, dead anyway.
Exactly.
And so the poem just collapses in on itself. It's like it's already dated by the time you've read it. Ozymandias, or any of the Keats odes, any that go on and on about Tintern, all of it.
Sure.
The reason it continues to fascinate and people continue to write about these works and wonder about them is because they absolutely transcend their own time.
Exactly. They transcend time, they transcend politics, they essentially speak to the fundamental human experience. And I think that's the great thing about any great poet of the past. And I think so many of the poets we have today will be forgotten because they don't write, as you said, there's no attention to language. So many poets just do the standard rupee core, lowercase everything, and then each line is just kind of very simplistic. And I've written some poems with like completely lowercase letters. I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think there's more of an attention to craft that needs to be there than there is present in so many of these kind of political poems ride off of their basic politics. I think it's so unfortunate that we've reduced poems to this state. And the other problem is that because there's not kind of a great poetry education, as you said, a lot of people don't know where to start. They don't know, they've never read Keats, maybe they haven't even heard of Keats. If you go directly outside of writing circles, most people wouldn't even be able to tell you a couple of romantics, or most people don't even know that Shakespeare wrote sonnets in addition to plays. So I think that's something that is very much lacking in our education system. And I write a lot. My day job is in education, so I always write about what's going on in the education sector. High schools have also completely abandoned the teaching of poetry, so I think it's not reaching a lot of young people. People aren't getting exposed to great literature. What do you think we should do, and is there a solution to something like this?
I have a lot of friends who teach. I have one friend who actually runs a classical academy, an independent school for kids, but I think it must start there with these schools that are not part of the public school system, but they have more freedom. I don't know what can change in public schools. The public schools I went to were just dreadful. And there was no actual, I don't know what I was ever taught. They just would pass out ditto sheets and fill them out, and it was like a memorization exercise every day. I didn't learn anything. Most of what I learned was in the library, just by myself. But yeah, I think it starts with exposing good poems to young people. If I do become the poet laureate of the United States, that'll be one of my tasks. Get good poems into the schools, because some of these big poetry organizations, Poetry Foundation, Academy of American Poets, because we're in National Poetry Month now. If you look at their websites, they have packets that teachers can give to their students, and these poems are horrible. They're exactly the kind of poems we were talking about. Yeah, exactly what we were talking about. And what is a young person going to? They're not going to learn anything. They're going to learn a lot about bad poetry, and then maybe try to imitate it, which is the way that we learn. I have a professor friend of course I'm not going to say who it is. I never would, but like he had to take Wallace Stevens off of his reading list because there was a big flap around 2020 because Wallace Stevens used an inappropriate word in a title of a poem and allegedly said something very inappropriate at a party. So these things get extrapolated, and the teachers get terrified because they don't want to get called. I don't know how that process works. They get called into the principal at their university. I don't know. So it's like they're like whitewashing their, no pun intended, whitewashing their reading lists, and there's no education going on in the creative writing world, and it's pumping out a bunch of sameness.
That little tale about Wallace Stevens absolutely broke my heart. He's one of my absolute favorites.
Yeah, I was just reading him the other day, and I'm like, this guy never gets old. I never get tired of reading Wallace Stevens.
His poem Sunday Morning actually features in the novel I just finished writing. Very big part of my novel, so that's actually one of my favorite.
What part?
So the character part of my novel deals with kind of religion, and a lot of that poem kind of questions what is divinity. She reads it as part of just trying to find herself, and she envisions herself as the complacencies. And I think that very much speaks to some of the themes in the novel, and then she ends up setting the first part of it to music, which is really fun. So yeah, I absolutely love Wallace Stevens, and I think
What is that line? And there's that word is in that poem, right?
complacencies are the
Complacencies.
peignoir.
Yeah, yeah. And there aren't oranges in there too.
Yes, and I think it's I don't remember the poem by heart. I should, but it's the first line is complacencies at the peignoir, and then
That's right. Yeah, he was
the,
really into fruit. Wallace
yes,
Stevens really loved fruit.
absolutely. Actually, I think Wallace Stevens was the first poet that I was exposed to. It was in my seventh grade. The first kind of American poet that I was exposed to was in my seventh grade English class. We read The Snowman, which is also another one.
Yeah.
And I had a very interesting English teacher. He interpreted the poem very literally, and he took us all outside. It was January to freeze because it was. I think he did that on purpose because he has that line about the January snow in the poem, and he made us stand in the snow for an hour and just look at nature. And then we all came back in, and then we were supposed to have a discussion of the poem after that experience. And I think it was just one of those very immersive experiences that I remember having.
And you'll never forget it.
Exactly.
Like that. That's a good teacher, in my opinion. Yeah.
He was fantastic. I actually wrote my kind of college entrance essay about this teacher. We had this thing that he did. He called it Poetry Friday. Every Friday we'd read a poem. And he'd bring in kind of his favorite poems. And I just loved that class so much. We read Langston Hughes. We read Paul Laurence Dunbar. We read an Oscar Wilde poem. So some really, really great names in there. And I think I was 12 at that time, so didn't fully immerse myself into that quite yet, but we had a lot of discussions about these poems, and one of the names that came up was T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland. I'll always remember this teacher, and I think most people know The Wasteland is my all-time favorite poem, and it is fantastic. That particular teacher brought that poem up to me, and he said, "Oh, don't read it now, you're not going to understand it," because I was 12. And obviously I don't think I understood any of it, but I read it. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting. I revisited it in high school, still didn't quite understand it. By the time I got to college and I was studying poetry, I took probably several courses where that poem was taught. And then I wrote my master's thesis on The Wasteland. So
Really? Oh, wow. Okay. So you probably know all the allusions throughout the poem, and that's interesting. I still haven't taken a deep dive into the annotated Eliot. I love The Wasteland, but I know it's full of allusions to
it's so rich. And
yeah.
The crazy thing is that I've written about this poem so many times. I wrote about it for my college classes, then for my master's thesis, then I did a Wasteland series on Pens and Poison actually like 6 months ago, and I read it again, and I took a lot from my thesis obviously, but that was more of creating a reading guide for The Wasteland, and I analyzed every section, and there were things that came out to me analyzing it more for an accessible audience than for an academia audience that I didn't really catch when I was reading it from like an academic perspective. That was really cool. There's just so much in that poem. I wrote my thesis on there's a lot of allusions to Wagner in the poem, so that was my master's thesis, was looking at how Wagner plays into Eliot's poem and what that says about some of the basic themes. But I think one thing that really came out to me when I was reading it on my own, because I had only really ever read it in the academic setting, one thing that never was mentioned by any of my professors, and I've probably had 4 or 5 professors teach The Wasteland in different ways, was this idea of fertility. And that to me was so crazy when I read it again, and I realized that's such a big theme in the poem, because it is politically inconvenient to talk about fertility, so therefore it was probably not mentioned, but that's the number one theme of the poem is it's the wasteland, things are barren, Eliot wants things to be more fertile, and there's so many allusions to like childbirth in there. There's the famous scene in the second part, The Game of Chess, where the woman is getting an abortion. There's obviously the whole land is barren. There's this idea of kind of the necessity of bearing children, and that's one of the conclusions he comes to towards the end is this, be fruitful and multiply. And I was very astonished when I reread it a couple years later, stepping away from academia. I was astonished that never came up in discussions of the wasteland at Columbia University, because that is fundamentally what the poem's about. So I think that tells you a lot about how these poems are taught in these kind of academic circles, that they omit various information that is inconvenient for them to discuss.
It's preemptive trigger warning. Let's just skip the trigger warning altogether and not trigger at all. I'm looking forward to reading your essays on the wasteland.
I'll send them over. I have an intro, and then I have a kind of breakdown of each section. I published the whole thing in one essay as well, so I'll send those over. Speaking of great poetry, I would love for you, if you're up to it, for you to read us one of the poems from America's Poem. I have my copy right here. Whichever one you want, just let me know which page to go to.
Let's see. Read page 41. First sign.
Fine, let's do it.
First sign. What divides shadow from light begins to soften. Notice the shape of the shade as the day contracts, and how the blue hydrangeas, bunched beside a pale brick wall, sink into the watery glare of a lucid dream. This is the first sign, the new season, stealing along the periphery. And isn't it a prayer to notice what's noticed? The prayer, the practice, the way one walks through an unimagined world.
Wow. I love the imagery there. I love the blue hydrangeas. I always love floral imagery. I think being a lover of T.S. Eliot, I have to love the floral imagery. He does that a lot. Yeah, amazing poem. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what inspired this poem and how your writing process looked for it?
Yeah, so it's in these stepped lines, these tercets that each line is staggered outward. And it never really came together in any kind of coherent way, except in the poetry itself. And for me, that stepped line, the 3-line stanza that moves out continuously, just gave my thought a framework within which to also continue to move outward, so I could keep moving into one image after another and one thought after another. And it's interesting sometimes how form plays with content, in that it can really drive the content in a way that would not have driven it if the form wasn't there. I love how that can work. I don't write in terminally metrical forms. There are no sonnets or iambic pentameter in here. But I do like to write in syllabic forms quite often. And it's fascinating to me how writing in a syllabic form, meaning, I know you know what it means, but for your listeners, it's a certain number of syllables per line. And you start to think with the form, or the form thinks with you. And the language that can be very surprising in a way. And that's one of the real benefits of formalism, is how it can be a real conduit for the language. But it takes a long time, I think, and a lot of practice to get that down.
Once again, I love the imagery in this poem, and I think the stepped, what did we call that? The stepped lines?
Yeah, that was the formal inspiration. And also I had just moved to upstate New York when I wrote the poem, so I was really enchanted with a new landscape, new things to look at. I pretty much stay within a 5-block radius, so I have a whole new 5 blocks to explore. And yeah, that's where the poem's coming out of. 5 blocks.
Fantastic. I've read some of them. I will read the rest over the coming weeks as well. Joseph Massey, thank you so much for your time today on the Pens and Poison podcast. Anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with before we wrap for today?
Just thank you for your work, because you are a rare individual. What are you, 27? And you're not necessarily going against, but you are not playing along with all of the crap. And that's really refreshing for a geriatric like me. It's just nice to see the young people doing something different.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And if you guys want to hear more from Joseph Massey, he writes the Substack Dispatches from the Basement, which I am subscribed to. Really fantastic poems on there. He publishes his poetry. And Joseph, do you have a website as well where people can find you?
They could go to poetrydispatches.com.
Okay. Thank you guys for listening to the Pens and Poison podcast, and we'll be back soon with some more great literary themes.